Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth episode of the Customer Educated podcast. As always, my name is Akash Anil, and today marks a very special episode for me because it's the fifth episode, and I'm really happy to share the space with Eric Mistry from Content Square. Hey, Eric, how are you?
Good. How you doing?
I'm doing great, man. This podcast was bound to happen, but how I reached out to you is a very funny story. As I mentioned, I was going through Heap on LinkedIn and then found out that we both are mutually connected and just messaged you. And then here we are.
Yeah, those mutual connections and the researching in like, oh, who do I know at this space, or who do I know kind of know through this space is I found one of the best ways to find the people you actually want to talk to.
And so for the listeners out there, I have to say that Eric is a very friendly person. And I say this because I messaged him and he replied back in 5 minutes. And one of the greatest things about our conversation was that I was looking at the screen for about 10 minutes and I could see Eric typing out his entire job profile. And that gave me a proper understanding of what he's been doing with Heap. Now, Heap has been, I think it's been acquired by Content Square, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, they just completed the acquisition in December, and we've been rolling along with all the kind of the nuts and bolts of putting the companies together and making things work. So it's been a really exciting time to be first at Heap and now
Yeah.
officially Content Square.
That's nice. I mean, and your position is quite interesting as well. I've met customer
Yeah,
education specialists, enablement specialists. Operations is something that I've not heard about. Customer education's operations manager is something that I've not heard about. Do you have an interesting story of how you got into this space? In general, customer education.
yeah. In general, the customer education, it's been quite the, let's call it, a journey. I never, you know, sought out customer education as a space. I didn't honestly know it existed until I fell into it. I started out after undergrad and college in healthcare IT, working for Epic, building uh, healthcare software. And then I moved into higher education IT, essentially that person that sits between the relatively non-technical faculty and the really technical IT department. So working as a translator, trying to say, they need this to improve the classroom, and the IT department needs it phrased in this way, or the IT department can communicate this really technical thing. They have these resources. They want to help. What are the best ways to get that to the faculty? That was a super interesting role. We did everything from virtual reality to video development, custom courses, massive open online courses. Obviously, in COVID, online learning was huge for us. And so, yeah, I was really a pedagogy and technology expert in one. Um, Post-pandemic, I decided that I wanted to explore areas outside of higher education, and through a mutual friend, found Heap. I looked at the values, applied for a customer success manager role, did not get that,
Okay.
but kept my eye on the company and eventually found a senior instructional design role and got into that. And that's where I landed in customer education. And we can maybe jump into the rest of the story, or I can go into how I landed in the current role if you'd like.
Actually, so a lot of people that I meet in the customer education world have transitioned from educational fields, right? Even the first episode that I did with Monica Sandwani, she was I think she was teaching in a college. And the last podcast with Vicky Kennedy, right? I asked her this question about whether people who have been in the educational field have this ability to understand how to build curriculums and how to build courses. And that kind of translates. I mean, I understand why you joined as an instructional designer. Did that help you being in an educational
Yeah,
background?
yeah. I would say having an instructional background, having a experience, seeing how folks who are at the top of their game with instructing on anything.
Hmm.
I worked with faculty from everywhere from healthcare to philosophy.
Okay.
Seeing how do they break down those complex topics? How do you engage uh, a really tired college student for an 8 a.m. class?
Yeah.
If you can engage them, customers who want to try your software and learn your software. They're easy. So that I think is a really big asset, is understanding what pieces make education work really well, what pieces make online education work really well, was definitely an asset. And I think understanding that in the customer education space helps a lot, and getting the fuller picture of why do we want to do these tactical things. There's all the models and the hierarchies and I kind of call it the book smarts of it, and then there's the really tactical what works. A lot of times they're overlapping, but knowing what's really going to work and kind of stepping away from the book smarts of pedagogy into the practical pedagogy is a really good thing to have in customer education.
That's nice. It's interesting to know. And so anyone who's listening, if you're in educational field and want to transition into SaaS, probably this would be a good career option for you. Anyways, getting back to the topic, I have to say, to be very honest, when I was researching for this topic, right, we'll get into what the topic is for the listeners out there, but specifically when I was researching about automations in customer education, there isn't any content out there. And I'll get into this question of why is it, but it was really surprising because I see a lot of content on Gen AI in customer education, how artificial intelligence, how LLM models are influencing customer education, but the conversations around the simplest aspects of using automations to fuel customer education is absent. Why do you think that is the case?
I think a lot of times folks don't really think too much about it. A lot of my peers in similar roles, it tends to either be not their full function. I'm really lucky that it is. It's a role that's a full function for me. A lot of folks do what I started out doing, which is I was a senior instructional designer doing automation work on the side, improving processes. It wasn't necessarily, oh yeah, I'm an automator. It was, I'm an instructional designer who does some automation work. So I think there's that identity piece. And then I think also, until I started working with the automation community, I didn't realize how much the same folks share the same problems. Yeah. That, oh, this process that I did for my particular company with our particular workflows, sharing that process might be really helpful for folks. So that's I think why there's a relative lack of content focused on customer education automation. And then also teams are usually pretty small. There's a lot of places that are a team of one. And if they have time to automate, they may not have time to share about it too. So I think there's a lot of really good invisible work being done out there. But I also think a lot of folks don't have the time right now, or think they don't have the time to invest in automation.
No, but after our conversation that we had last week, and that was for about 2 hours, and you taught me how to use, at least you put the thought into my head that, when you're doing something, automations can really help you in simplifying the workflow and, reducing a lot of manual work. And I think when I research about, as a marketer, when I do the research around automations, I see a lot of content. Automations in marketing, sales ops, operations. But when it comes to customer education, it's something new. So this podcast is going to be it's going to pave the way for people to talk about automations, customer education. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of what I try to do, particularly in talking to folks who are maybe new to automation, is it's not so much I'm going to teach you everything you need to know. I'm going to be planting a lot of seeds. There's going to be a lot of places where I'm going to say something. It might be, look at this, dig into it. It might be what you need for your particular thing. So understanding the core of like, why do we want to automate? How do we identify opportunities for automation? How do we look at our systems and build them so automation becomes a lot easier to do? All those kind of things that as soon as you start to think about them, as soon as those seeds are planted, it becomes a lot more of what you think about on the day-to-day.
That's nice. So we'll get into that in detail for everyone listening out there. Let's get into your current role now. You mentioned that this current role was specifically created for you, and it has a lot to do with the topic that we're going to talk about, that is automations. So let's get into that first so that the listeners understand your expertise in this particular topic.
Yeah. So my current role, I'm the Strategy and Shared Services Operation Manager. And what that essentially means is I'm working with the teams at Content Square that education is one of those teams, but there's a few teams that are also adjacent and under that broader umbrella. And those teams work really closely together. And it's really good to have operations just in education. We actually are lucky enough to have I have an awesome counterpart who is solely focused on education. But then I'm able to sit kind of at a little bit of a higher level of looking at all three at once. And how do those groups interact together? Which is, I think, a really cool place to be, because you can start to see the patterns. You can start to see where do these groups interact and how do the groups outside of our department feed into our department as well. So it's a very exciting role. It's they had to figure out where exactly is the right place for someone with my particular skill set and like what I want to do, what I'm interested in doing. I was lucky enough that they crafted it for me, because they saw we have a lot of different places we can use this skill set. What's the ideal combination for us? And it's still a relatively new role, so every day has been different, and that's, I think, always a super exciting thing in any role.
So if you were to, in essence, a very brief explanation of what is that particular skill set that you're talking about, that would give the listeners a better understanding of what the topic is.
Yeah, so I think my particular skill set that I bring to bear in this job is I look at processes in education and beyond, and identify opportunities for automation, opportunities for process improvement, and then I call it making machines talk to each other. We've got a lot of different sources, from everything from an LMS to a CRM that we're using, and getting those pools of data in different places and putting the right data in front of the right people is the core kind of skills of what I do on a day-to-day.
Makes a lot of sense, because they say data is the new oil, but the problem is there's so much data. There is so much data out there that picking out the right data can make a lot of difference in the way you envision the future of the company. Correct?
Exactly. Yeah. And to really kind of stretch your metaphor even farther, you got to remember that oil, when it comes out of the ground, is not really usable. Like, we got to refine it. We got to throw it through a whole lot of different things. And that, I think, is something that's important, is you got to refine it, and then you also have to get it to the right people. It doesn't matter if it comes out of the ground somewhere else, but if you can't get it to me here in northern Minnesota, we're in real trouble. It's not very useful to me. So getting that refined oil to the right place, to really stretch this metaphor almost a little too far, is a key aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you, and we'll be discussing this to a large extent with the later part of the podcast. And I think now everyone gets a taste of what the topic is. It's about automations and how you can use automation to scale your customer education teams. And one of the things that we always talk about when it comes to customer education is it's not a siloed approach. It's not a siloed thing. And you need to have data from a lot of internal teams that come together to make the program successful. So we'll be discussing that as well. So I think we spoke about automation. We kept on mentioning the name automations like around 20 times right now. But what is the simplest definition to automation? And I want a definition that CS and CED folks can really connect with.
Yeah, I think the core of it, and there's, like with anything, there's a million definitions for it. I try to distill things down to the simplest possible piece. For me, it's turning repeated processes or manual work into processes that can run automatically or with, let's say, minimal inputs. You really want to save time while improving, the customer experience and consistency with it. It can be something as simple as like sending reminder emails or thank you emails, or piping events from your learning management to your CMS. So yeah, it's really about that. Things that happen a lot, things that happen regularly, or things that just take a little bit too much manual work. Really great things to think about automating.
So it's basically, in essence, really looking at what you do on a daily basis and simplifying that workflow for you. Correct?
Exactly. Yeah, there's I think folks, and I was falling into this same trap, is um, we looked at the state of like how was it when I entered the field? How was it, 2, 3 years ago even? Uh, Automation was very nascent. It was very complicated to get into. Um, and now when you look at it, almost every tool has some automations, even
Yeah.
things like Jira or Monday or things like that. Like a dedicated automation platform like Zapier. Those were still pretty young and pretty uh, underutilized. And I think if folks take a look at the current state of affairs in automation, they'd be surprised at just how easy it is to use.
True.
Um,
I completely agree, because after our conversation last week, I did go check out Zapier. A lot of stuff happening there. I mean, the way this particular app is able to connect with different platforms, it's just amazing what's happened out there. And the problem is we're not aware of it. So this podcast is going to make people aware of it.
yeah, if you take nothing else away from this podcast, it is go check out Zapier. It is the coolest product. I feel like I should at this point almost be a paid spokesperson for them because of how many people I just wax poetic about what an amazing product and what they're doing too. They haven't just built something great and stepped away. Every day when I log in, there's something new or some new research or some really good content to do. So shout out Zapier. You are an awesome company to work with.
This is officially a very good advertisement for Zapier at the end of the day after the podcast. Yeah, so Zapier's gonna pay us for this podcast.
Yeah, I can be sponsored like NASCAR. I'll put your logo on everything I wear. That's fine.
That's great. So I want to ask you. We spoke about your operations role before, and
yes,
would you say that this particular role of being in operations, a customer education operations manager, has in a way pushed you towards learning about automations and using it as a solution?
Yeah, I think that something that's kind of interesting in thinking about this, because obviously with this new role I've been thinking about it a lot, is that operations and automation are kind of one and the same, but they're also different. I think you can't do really good operations without automation, but you really can't do good automation without a good sense of how operations works. The better you organize and the better you have mapped your operations, that's the key to having really good automations. And vice versa. If you have really good automations, that means your operations are in a row and in a good state where you can have that. So I've kind of been learning about them hand in hand and seeing, coming from an outside perspective, coming from higher education and customer education into the field of operations. I'm lucky enough, I have a lot of that still like beginner's mind. I'm asking those questions that may be really dumb, may be really obvious, but they may also be things that people haven't thought about in the field. So that's a really exciting place. I'm still learning a ton. I am by no means the end-all be-all expert. So there's plenty of other folks to have on the podcast after me that are even better at the whole operations side of the house.
So one key takeaway that I had was it's very important to understand the entire flow of things that happen in an organization if you want to automate things, which makes sense to me now.
Yes. Yeah, I think the idea of mapping, and I think we can save this for later on, but I think mapping your processes out, regardless of whether you're going to be doing automation or not, is going to be one of those useful investments of time you can spend. Because you can start to see, what do we think is happening? What should be happening? And then when it's time to automate, you take that same map and you say, oh, these steps would be great to automate, or these steps are where a lot of manual labor happens. These steps are a bottleneck. How can we change the process so it's not a bottleneck?
Yeah, makes sense. Yes.
Mapping is key.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, so one of the things that I constantly hear from customer education people, more so from customer success, is it's very important to have a proper handoff from the sales to the customer success. So Now, I'm going to say this, that does this process mapping start from the time that you onboard a customer from the salesperson, or does it happen before?
Personally, like my really detailed mapping happens post handoff, but I've started to see it's really important to map the before as well. Even from the time they are like a very raw prospect, because going back to like what's that kind of source of truth? Where's our information coming from? What's feeding that automation and mapping? It's if your sales team can put in really detailed pieces of like who's the champion, who's interested in education, who's the technical implementer. If those pieces are in your CRM and then they become a full-on customer, it's a signed thing, the deal's done, you can immediately start targeting those exact people with targeted messaging about your educational offerings. And you can also track in your CRM, hey, has our technical lead done the technical training?
Okay.
And that, I think, is a really good metric to think about for any sort of SaaS company, any sort of customer education program. Making sure the right people are getting the right education can be so key to avoiding churn and making sure it's a successful piece. A lot of folks are flying blind with this, but if you can get an idea of who needs to be educated and what do they need to be educated on, that can be a really great metric for our CSMs, and even just tie it back to sales to say, hey, tell this person, take this education, they're going to be sent as soon as they sign the deal. Like that is, it's a great workflow, and it's a great thing to think about the whole process, not just our particular niche of the process. I think there's a lot of silos, like we talked about before, but this particular piece of automation can make it super helpful. And it also gives them a reason to say, oh, I do need to put that accurate champion in or that accurate technical lead in because someone is relying on that data. It's not just this black box of I'm putting it in and it's no one's ever going to look at it. It's like, no, we're relying on it. Our team is relying on it. Your coworker is relying on it. So, and it just gives us more opportunities to talk to sales too, which is just they've got such interesting processes, and it's an organization where ops is a little bit more mature as a general field. So getting an idea from the sales ops folks of, oh, what things are you doing? What can we borrow? What can we steal and kind of convert into education is also just fantastic.
So one thing that I really understood from the conversation that we had right now was that more than building automations, at the end of the day, when you dig deep into data, you're able to communicate with your team members that this data point exists. They probably never knew that this data point existed before the time that you try to do automations. So have you had any kind of instance where people have been surprised that, okay, we could have used this? It's giving us a better picture of what's happening.
Yeah, I think that a really clear example of that is our learning management software automatically pipes course completion to what was Heap and is now Content Square. So we could see the analytics of, okay, they completed this course, and then what did they do in the software, which is an awesome use case. One of the automations I did was I actually grabbed via the API and via Zapier the lesson completion. So did they complete 2/3 of the course? And are they going in and doing more pieces? So having that more granular piece of data is just one example of it's a data point we didn't have before automation. It would have been really tough to get, even just with a weekly upload of download all the lesson completion, put it into our analytics tool. Now it just happens automatically. As they complete the lesson, it fires into our system. We've got that data point. And then another data point that we didn't really have is that idea of, oh, we have the technical lead marked in our CRM, marked in our Salesforce that says we can target this particular person or people who have this role, and what percentage of these people with this role have taken our technical training course. Because those are things where we can show real impact. We can prove that, maybe not prove, but correlate that them taking this training makes them less likely to churn, makes them a stickier customer, makes them a better user of the platform. that I think is something where automation really comes into play. We can start to answer the questions that would be impractical to answer otherwise.
Seems like a very simple thing, but yeah, I think when you look at it from a strategic perspective, makes a lot of sense. I know this as a marketer, data is everything. You got to get the right data to make sure that the campaign is working. Okay, let's not get into the marketing side of things, but let's dive down and understand what common problems or tasks can be completed and solved using automations. And let's stick to the ambit of customer education.
Yeah, I was gonna say that is the short answer is everything. Okay. Everything can be automated, and then it's the practical question of, is it worth automating? But I would say that the core things when I break down what are the main problems I'm solving is, one is scheduling and kind of drip email flows to customers for custom training. So when a customer signs up for training, instead of having to check daily and say, okay, these customers have their training in 5 days, send them the 5-day out email reminder. This customer has their training tomorrow, send them their email. This customer completed their training, send them the survey. Those are the kind of things that can just be automated, can be saving time. Even things as simple as, we got a survey response that customer rated it really negatively. We want to get a little bit more feedback from them. That's the kind of thing where you can set up an automation, put in a little bit of fuzzing on a time delay to make it seem even a little more human, make it come from me, not training at heap.io. And it simplifies those things that we're going to see all the time. Project management software, it's great if you use it. And so one of the things we're working a lot on is getting data into our project management software. So using things like Slack and building automations directly into Slack that either with emojis or with some keywords, we can send tickets directly into our project management software like Monday. And then when things are happening in project management software, sending updates, putting it where people are looking. People don't tend to, until they have a habit, go into the project management software. People do use their Slack all the time. So if we can put the data in front of them, if we can, meet them where they're at and use automation to bridge that, really great use case. And then finally, I think the big core one for customer education is you've got training data in your learning management system. We use SkillJar, for example, and I pipe a ton of information from SkillJar, even though they have really good analytics. That I could be fine without piping it, but I pipe it directly into Heap. I pipe it directly into Content Square to say what's happening in this, what's happening in the product. I pipe it into a Google Sheet so I can say, okay, how long between someone signing up for a path to completing a path? Are we seeing any sort of stopgaps? That is so handy to be able to move your data automatically out of your LMS and into other really interesting places. So I'd say those are the three core things that I do often.
And just to all the people who are listening, this was a very brief explanation. We'll be getting into this in full extent, in full deep knowledge gaining towards the end of the podcast. So I want to, when a person listened to that conversation that we had, there are two things probably that comes up in every person's mind. One is, do I need automations when I can just subscribe to a product that does everything for me? And the second thing is, what do I automate versus what do I not automate? So I think these two important questions need to be addressed.
Yeah, so to answer the first question, like, why would I subscribe to something like Zapier when my, let's say, Monday.com has a pretty good automation engine built into it already? Or even something like SkillJar has a really good basic automation piece built into it. The core answer to that question is something like Zapier allows you to move outside of that individual product really, really easily. So I can do things in Google Docs, in Google Slides, in Google Sheets, in Slack, based on what's happening in SkillJar. That is not easy to do without something like Zapier. You need a lot more coding background, you need a lot more complexity, and things break. Something like Zapier makes that super easy. So that, I think, is the core answer to that. And then it also just opens up so many more doors when you have a dedicated tool that focuses on automation, that focuses on how does automation tie these systems together. Because Skilljar, their focus is being a learning management platform. Their focus is not being an automation platform. So I think there is really a strength there.
And
And then
yeah, and this is possible with any LMS out there, right? So you were using Skilljar,
yeah,
it's possible with any LMS. So you can be using either
yeah,
Skilljar or Trainn or Talent
yeah.
LMS,
It
anything you can.
really, yeah. The thing I always tell folks to look at is just Google the software you're trying to do and
Okay.
Zapier, see what pops up. And something like Trainn, for instance, when I was researching it, looked at your API. I'm like, oh, cool. I could do exactly the same things I'm doing in Skilljar in Trainn and be piping my data to where it needs to be. Zapier essentially makes using things that you would have to use an API and program your whole set of things really straightforward. So a good API is a really good sign for a lot of things, but there are also pre-built connections with Zapier that just it makes it so much easier.
Yeah, and I think all the apps that we use on a day-to-day basis is already there with Zapier, right? Be it Slack or Google Sheets, Google Docs. This is, I mean, everyone uses it at the end of the day. Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very cool because they have all the every kind of big name you could think of is in there.
Sure.
Salesforce obviously is a really big one that is so handy just to be able to not go into that very daunting interface sometimes, but be able to just find exactly what you need. But what's cool too is if it's not on there and there's an API, if there's webhooks, anything like that, you can really easily in Zapier connect those systems. So I really like to see that. And then to move into your second question, thinking about what do we automate versus what do we not automate. I would say take a look and find your pain points first. There's going to be way more things you want to automate than you have time to invest in automating. And getting back to those general trends of how can I solve this problem once and then copy that solution often. So like one problem I knew I needed to solve that was going to be worth the time and effort in getting that was how do I push events into Heap from Zapier that fit our naming flow and that fit the way that we use Heap. So solving that, I was like, okay, I just need to figure out this API call. I need to try some testing and to get it going. I now have a step that whenever I want to put data into Heap, I just copy and paste that step and it's solved. So that's a really good thing is finding those templates, building those things. Whenever I want to use an emoji in Slack to make something happen, solve that once. I can use that for all sorts of things. Whenever I want to send a really good looking email, I took the time to build a template. And now I have that email template ready to go. I can just change the wording out. But it's always going to look good. It's always going to be branded. Those are really good ways to solve that. But then I'd say target the things that are taking a bunch of time that shouldn't be, or that rely heavily on a human filling in data accurately. We as human beings are not great at filling in data accurately. I can attest just by virtue of seeing, signups for training. There's, people misspell their emails, people misspell their company, people misspell this, that, the other. You can remove a lot of human error with something like Zapier. So if you got mission critical data entry, seeing how can you get that in there. Mission critical processes, like if something has to be uploaded every week, okay, that's got some really good kind of flags for me. As soon as I said that, I was like, that sounds automatable because it's the same content, it's being uploaded on a consistent schedule every week, and it's going to the same place. That just says automate that. Like it's going to be something that is very useful to have automated.
I have a question to ask you, but I'm going to keep it towards the end of the podcast because I think we'll destroy the flow. One thing that I want to ask you is when you do all these things, there is always the question of talking about what is the ideal source of truth when it comes to building training programs and keeping the automation part of it aside. When you're bringing in all the sources of data together, what do you personally keep as an ideal source of data?
Yeah, so ideally, whenever I can use the CRM, whenever I have that available
Okay.
and it makes sense to interface with that, just by virtue of sales is using it. CSMs are using it. Everyone else should be using this, and or just like a data warehouse that's tied into that. Like having those big sources of data as your source of truth is very handy, because that means if I'm working on something, I'm working off the same data that everyone else has. For smaller things, I've sometimes made my source of truth something like a Google Sheet.
Okay.
So our training signups, just by virtue of it's a lot of information coming from Calendly, it's a lot of little bits and pieces that I need to be able to edit really quickly if I want to make a change. I pipe those things to a Google Sheet that then pipes out to other places. But yeah, I would say CRMs are great, and Google Sheets or Zapier has a product called Tables now that is incredibly cool. Speaking of how they just continually are innovating and adding to their product, very, very cool, and it doesn't use what they charge for. They call them tasks. So things like that. It's really a balance of that. Okay, availability of the data, interoperability with your particular tool that you're trying to get into, and then ease of access.
Yeah. So HubSpot, that's the first CRM that comes to my mind. So
yeah, that would work great. I've worked primarily in something like Salesforce, Gainsight. HubSpot is also just fantastic for doing it. We've even pulled data from Snowflake for particular really cool things.
So we'll get in.
And then
go on.
Yeah, I mean, just coming from Heap, we used Heap as a source of truth for a lot of things. When we're talking about, okay, what has customer done in product? That's a great source of truth for us for that. It says these customers have done X, Y, and Z. Yeah. And now Content Square has that same thing.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, a lot of analytics platforms, so for example, Heap, Google Analytics, Plausible, all these apps can be a source of truth, correct?
Exactly. And I would say you want to, trust but verify for any of those is are you looking at the right data? That's something we think a lot about with Heap, is like understanding where the data comes from. We really taste the soup, and we're looking at our own training data. We're like, is this accurate? So I even just make sure that my data in Heap, it consistently matches what I see in the learning management system. I'm now really confident in that data, because I'm piping it in from a variety of places. I want to make sure I'm not double piping it or something like that. But yeah, it's really nice to have a tool like Heap, like Content Square, where you can look at and manipulate the data that you've collected.
Nice. So we're going to get into that section where people get actionable insight into how to drive automations. And the first thing that comes to my mind is support tickets. And so we had this conversation before of how you beautifully integrated Slack with a lot of systems in your company. So my question is going to be, can you use automations to answer support tickets using Slack? Any integrations that can be done?
Yeah, so that's the short answer. Yes, you can use Slack to tie into any support ticket systems. We have, obviously, for IT and for other places, very formal support systems that work great. They've already got their own Slack interfaces, etc. But we also have internally, and I think a lot of companies have the same thing, where there's internal support channels. We have Talk to Customer Education as one of our internal support channels. So anyone has a customer education question, they type on this channel, they say, okay, hey, when can I schedule training? What kind of trainings are available? I can't find this trainer's availability. And then we go in and we answer them. And it's not necessarily a ticket, but it's we have to respond to these. We have almost an implied SLA that says, yeah, we're going to get to these as soon as we possibly can. And these are often mission critical questions for the CSM. They might have the customer on the line and they're trying to schedule training. They're trying to figure it out. We set up in Slack just an automated bot that says, hey, you sent this question. Here's our top 5-6 questions that we get all the time. Those ones I just mentioned. Hey, how do I schedule training? What's the link? I can't find availability. What do I do? we answered that, and we then have a second automation that says, if we didn't answer your question correctly, put this particular emoji.
Okay.
Right now I'm using the "this is fine" dog meme emoji where the world's on fire around it.
Okay.
Kind of the emoji of 2020 and beyond. If the CSM presses that emoji on their message, it immediately flags it to our team that says, hey, we didn't answer the question with this particular bot response. You need to take a look at this. It drops it just directly into our DMs and says, you got time to look at this? Look at this. So we can see people are asking these particular questions, but also these are the questions that we're needing to escalate on. So that's a very scalable process. You can customize it to whatever you really need to do. And like I said before, this is the most basic. This was like 30 minutes in an afternoon putting that together. When I have more time and using like Zapier's AI tools and other pieces, be able to like parse the response and say, looks like this person's asking about training scheduling. Let me give them the training scheduling specific question. Or it looks like this person's asking about courses in our LMS. Let me give them the LMS specific pieces. And even just being able to draw on our internal wikis and say, you can find more information on this internal wiki.
I want to ask that question.
So yeah, AI is everywhere, and I think that's somewhere we're going to see it really start to get put in as well, is these really smart bot responses that anyone can build in Slack. And I build all these things in Zapier just because I can build really fast in Zapier. Slack has its own internal automation system that's good, but it's just so much easier to do for me in Zapier. And it then also lets me, I pipe those responses into a Google Sheet as a source of truth to be able to run sentiment analysis and data on them later on.
Nice.
When are we getting questions in? Are there people who we're seeing a lot of questions from? Particular teams we're seeing a lot of questions from? Just to get real nerdy on it.
So essentially what you've done is you've built a chatbot within Slack to answer your questions. And the more creative you get, you can answer the queries of every customer in some or the other possible way. For example, I'm thinking, so you've created an automation where it tells you that you can search for answers to your query here. You can probably create another automation which says that your answer for this query is there in our knowledge base in the form of a video or an interactive guide or whatever it is. And even after that, if they're not getting the answer, probably they can come back to you with the fireside emoji that you spoke about.
Yeah, exactly. It's that idea of figuring out what do people really want, and then what are we spending a lot of time on. So like our team, before we put that in, was replying to every single one of those questions of, hey, where do I schedule training? They have to grab the link, they have to paste the link in, and they might be doing that an hour later, 2 hours later. If it's time zones, it might be the very next day instead of getting an instant response. So it's a win-win. We save time, and the CSM gets a plausible answer to most of their questions right away. I think those base questions were probably 75% of the questions that we got. And that's how we actually designed that initial Slack bot response. It was like, what are we getting a ton of questions on all the time? And same few questions.
And so I think there's a lot of cross-team conversations that happen. So you're the person who builds the automations. I'm assuming that you have to sit with the customer success person and understand what are the usually received queries so that you guys can sit together and figure this out, right?
Yeah, and I do want to make it clear that this is kind of internal to internal is where I've built this. I would be way more cautious about building an external facing Slack bot, especially anything that's going to use AI. But this is really good for those internal channels. But you could, with some caution, with some more dedicated build time, build a similar thing for customer facing bot as well. Building bots is getting easier and easier, and that's actually have some time on my calendar next week to test out Zapier's new. They have a brand new chatbot interface that I'm super excited to get into.
Is it the one that I was talking to you about, the Gen AI chatbot, where you ask like for example, you put in the query that I want to integrate Google Sheets with LinkedIn, and it gives you a set of Zaps. Is that the one that you're talking about?
No, it goes beyond that. They're doing so much more than I can even It's a whole podcast just on Zapier's AI bits. They've actually just released an invite only group for folks doing AI stuff. So I'm just excited to dig into that as well.
Nice.
But this particular feature, as I understand it, is letting you essentially build like a GPT or a GPT informed chatbot based on sources of your data, and it can run some other automations based on what the customer says. So it can run an automation to say, look in your Google Sheet and find data, and if it's not an answer, write it to the Google Sheet. So it's moving beyond the basics of a chatbot, really starting to get into what can a smart assistant do.
Okay,
it's one of those
sense,
things I'm going to need to do some time to sit down and dig into it, but it seemed like a really cool tool to have available.
But I think there's this query that raises that every person has. I'm not a technical person. Do I need to be technically sound? Do I need to have a proper understanding of how systems work to use a particular platform like Zapier or any platform in order to build automations? What would you say?
I think you need to be less technical than people think.
Okay.
I think having a technical understanding is always going to be an asset. But the big term we see a lot on LinkedIn is no-code operations. There's actually a really great community. We can talk more about that, but you do not need to be super technical to do this. It's when you look at Zapier and when you look at all these automation tools, you're essentially building your automations into, there's a trigger. So like what's going to start that automation? Okay. It's something like receiving a Slack message. It's an emoji has been tagged on a message in this channel. We've received an email from a customer. That's a trigger. Yeah. And then downflow from that, you have as many actions as you want. Okay. So we're going to send a Slack back. We're going to send an email. We're going to add an entry to the CRM. Those things can all happen in one Zap. It can all happen in one automation. The automations can trigger other automations. So when this automation runs, wait a few minutes, see the results, and then run this next automation. So you don't need to be terribly technically sound to know, okay, when I receive a message in this Slack channel, then send this message. I think anyone listening, I have full confidence, could build that Zap with almost no issue. Where it starts to get into the more technical side of things is, okay, when this kind of question's asked, I want this kind of answer. There's branching, there's variables, there's all those pieces. That's where it starts to get technical. But the real basics of automation, anyone can do.
I think there's another query that comes up in every person's mind when they're listening to this is people who have not used Zapier. So I've used Zapier, you've used Zapier, so we understand how it works. But just correct me if I'm wrong, but it's basically like in Word document, you have two shapes and you're connecting each shape with an arrow, right? So that's how Zapier works. So the first shape would be a particular task, like for example, import data from LinkedIn. And the second shape would be your Google Forms. your Google Sheets. And so that is the connection that you're drawing. So it's fairly simple for a person who doesn't have technical knowledge, but has used any simple tool, like for example, Microsoft PowerPoint, or even to a large extent, Lucid Chart. I think it mimics the same flow as Lucid Chart, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, it's very similar to that, where you're essentially just putting pieces together. And if you can map flows on a non-technical level, if you can say, this thing happens, then this thing happens. Zapier's even added in the AI tool you were talking about earlier, where you can just type. You can say, when I receive a message in this Slack channel, I want to send a custom response via Slack. You type that in the top of the Zap editor. It will grab and put together the particular pieces.
Yeah.
And the cool thing they do, and people are wondering, how does it know what Slack channel to use and Slack piece for me? When you connect your Slack, just like you would connect, say, your Google Calendar to Calendly or Google Calendar to Zoom, it's things like that where you just authenticate. You say, yep, this is my login for Slack. Zapier has permission to send messages as me and read my messages. And again, that's why you want a really trusted platform like Zapier that has data protection, has everything built in. If Content Squares approves Zapier, I have no qualms about using it for anything in my life. That they have an amazing security team. So I'm like, yep, this is good. I can trust this software. But yeah, that's something I think to think about is you just really have to connect your softwares. And I actually go in Zapier. This is a really good tactical tip is look at the apps you've connected. It'll tell you all of the triggers and all of the actions that are built in already.
Okay.
So that's how I even knew that Slack can use an emoji reaction as a trigger. I wouldn't have thought of that. I wouldn't have thought, of course Slack can track when I emoji respond to something. But I'm like, I do that all the time. Yeah. What can I use that for automation? Mm-hmm. So dig deep. You get to see a lot more of what the tool can do.
That's great. I think the first example was just perfect. One of the reasons why I was really interested in doing this episode with you was the example that you gave about how you automated the entire instructor-led training booking process using Calendly. I'll let you explain it, but using Calendly and then Slack and Google Sheet, basically each and every tool that we've been using for a very long time. So if you can give that example of how you automated it would be great.
Yeah, this is actually one of my favorite examples because it's actually how I got into this whole ops and automation thing. This is the first thing I saw as a instructional designer. Was like, I need to fix this process. My manager said, "You seem technical. Can you make this better?" And then I went a little overboard and fixed a lot of things downstream that I was like, this bothers me. Let me fix that. So I'll give the state of the affairs, like when I first encountered the system and where we got to. So when I first got to Heap, the process for customer scheduling custom ILT, so an instructor-led training with a one-to-one with the customer. Yeah. It's part of the training services package. Very standard thing, happens all the time. Was the customer or the CSM would reach out to schedule a training session. Our director of customer education would look at the trainers' calendars and say, okay, this person has availability on one of the times you've listed. Let's schedule that. They'd create the calendar invite the instructor, set up the Zoom, have the instructor set up the Zoom actually. Okay. And then sometimes they'd have to do some back and forth saying, hey, we don't have time this week, but there's time this week. Working across time zones, all those pieces. And then they'd have to, once the training request is in there, put it into our CRM, and then the trainer would have to keep track of their trainings. They'd have to look, what do I have in 5 days? Okay, let me send the 5-day out reminder. What do I have in 3 days? Let me send the 3-day out reminder. What trainings are happening tomorrow? Let me send tomorrow's reminder. Oh, I just delivered a training. Let me send the follow-up emails. All these things were happening constantly. And then after the training finishes, I need to go into the CRM and close the ticket. So that's a whole another 2 or 3 systems to log into. So that's happening with every single training. That's happening multiple times a week, and not just like all at once. It's not like, oh, on Monday, all of our training requests come in. This is like, it's happening Monday at 3 and Tuesday at 9 a.m. And it's all depending on one person to respond and set up these things. And let's be frank, my director had a lot more important, better things to be doing than scheduling trainings. So what we did instead, where we got to, is this combination of Calendly, Zapier, Google Sheets, Trello, and a few other products. But essentially, we built a Calendly site that had all the different training types. And the customer, CSM, could sign up for a training slot that worked for them. Yeah. It would take a look, Calendly would take a look at our trainers' calendars that they've synced with it and say, yep, this person's the best person to deliver this training. And, we're not overloading one person getting all the trainings and one person getting no training. So it's smart like that. That information goes through, the customer fills in their data, so like the company name, what they want to know about in the training, all these things that used to be a bunch of emails back and forth. That pipes through to our CRM, automatically created a training request, automatically created a calendar event on the trainer's calendar and on the general training calendar, so the director could see at a glance what trainings are coming up. And then it also would set up a Trello system where we could set those emails for the 5 days out, 3 days out, 1 day out
Hmm.
post. So those emails would send automatically based on the date of the scheduled training. And then with all of that, we actually set up a little Slack channel that every time these automations ran, so when a training was scheduled, when the CRM training request was put in, when a training was complete, it would just send, hey, automation ran, this is who attended the training, this is who signed up for the training. It's all in the Slack channel, and it's all also feeding to, like I said before, a Google Sheet source of truth. So we can take a look and say, okay, what days of the week are we in the most trainings? What times do people want to do trainings that we don't have available?
Okay.
So we have that data as well. So all in all, we ended up saving hours of time per week for the director of customer education, and on the sending emails side of thing, tons of hours for the trainers as well. And then going back to the earlier tangent I had on consistency, we know that every single training request, when it's done, is going to get closed appropriately. It's going to have the customer's emails noted in it. It's going to be done consistently well. So that means we can trust that data even more in the CRM that says this customer's received this training. We don't have to depend on the trainer remembering to do every perfect step. So I think that's just one example of, this is a process that they were doing it for years like that. That was improved by automation, and it was not terribly tough. This was the first project I automated. I actually learned Zapier while doing this project. So that is just one really good example, I think, of.
So in essence, what you did was, with few automations, you saved a lot of time that could have been used for other important things. Like for example, you mentioned, instead of your director sitting and looking at emails, he just has one glance at everything, and he has the information for it. So if you were to quantify, how much time did you save with these automations?
I mean, on a weekly basis, I would say we were probably saving 15 to 20 hours of my director's time. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but I would say on average, 15 to 20, just by virtue of, I also like to count time saved as, do I have to break out of the task I'm doing to do this? Because for me, when I break out of the task that I'm doing, okay, I'm going to send an email that only takes 5 minutes, but to get back into the flow of planning projects and thinking about strategy to respond to an email, you're really looking at a half hour, even though it's like a 5-minute email. That's the kind of thing where they don't also have to worry about, oh, I have to check the emails because it's coming in. So 15 to 20 hours of director time, and then for the trainers, anywhere from 10 to 20 hours. Just because they have to type the customer's name in the email, they have to send it to the right person, they have to check, okay, what's coming up this, and they're trying to do that between training sessions. That's a recipe for missing something, making a mistake, or just being stressed. So let's take stress off people's brains and let the robots do the work.
So it's productivity at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, productivity and just ease of life, I think, is the other big thing.
Makes sense.
This is all an investment in improving your quality of life.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I mean, because booking ILT, it seems like a very complex process, and I want to address. I mean, you're going to address it. How many Zaps were built into this? So if you could explain what a Zap is as well, and then get into the answer, that would be great.
Yeah, so Zap is a kind of a shorthand for a Zapier automation. So I think of them as, there's a trigger and then there's multiple steps after it. And this is actually a good core lesson for anyone listening that wants to get into this. When I first built it, I had what I like to call kind of a mega Zap. So the customer entering Calendly was like step 1, and it had 50 steps below it. All these various processes were happening after it. And what I found is that really makes it a lot more fragile. So instead, what it's got split into is, this ended up being somewhere in the range, I think it's like 15 different smaller Zaps now. So the core one that starts everything off is a customer enters a query in Calendly and says, I want to schedule a training for this date. That one basically just, it writes the data to the source of truth, sends a Slack to our team. It makes the calendar event. It makes the CRM training request.
Okay.
Then there's a secondary one that runs kind of in between those steps that looks up, did the customer enter their company name as we know it in the CRM, and did they enter their Keep contact as we know them in the CRM? If they didn't do that, then kind of pause the creation of the CRM ticket, and it lets us put in and manually fix that, or it looks up and just writes it itself. It'll say, oh, this company, like, it's Heap in what they put, but it's Heap Inc. in our CRM, so we'll just match that against their email and say, this is what we think it is, but just confirm this, make some human checks on this to make sure we're doing the right thing. And then there's all the downflow of the 5 days out email, the 3 days out email, the 1 day out email. Those got separated into individual Zaps. Because what's nice with that then too is if something's breaking or if we want to tweak one particular element, we're not taking the whole system offline to do 1 or 2 tweaks to something downstream. And then when a training finishes, it's automatically going to send a training training email that says, how do we do? Like, that's its own separate little Zap. We can turn that one on and off. We can customize that, like that. So yeah, a lot of little Zaps fed by one initial hit. And then obviously we had to build, because there's always going to be manual situations, but we still want it to work in the automated system, is what happens when we have to put in a manual request. So I essentially built a parallel series of Zaps that instead of a customer entering information from Calendly, we have our own internal Google form that we can fill in the exact same information. And then it runs off those same steps. So everything else happens downstream from that, as it should, but we can still manually work in that. Which I think is another important lesson for folks is automate, but also build in that backdoor so you can still do some things manually.
Oh, that's a good, understood. But I think as you start building more and more Zaps or start using automations, I think the way it looks to me is that you look at a particular process and then you're able to draw up Zaps in your head. You already understand what the workflow is going to look like when you were to do it on Zapier. And how does one build a skill for this? Is it building more and more automations, or is it, and would you say that you already had that high level thinking of, maybe if I connect this system and this system, it would work out great?
Yeah, I think naturally I've always been like a very geeky, nerdy person. We have a lot of the home automation stuff, like smart lights and smart locks, and that my wife hates it, but it's one of those things I've always been geeky about. Like, I can connect systems and I can think about systems being connected. But as far as learning how to do this, one of the simplest ways is just learn by doing. So look at a simple problem. Start with something simple like building just a Slack bot that says, when I do this thing in Slack, this thing happens. Or when something comes through Google Forms, I want this particular document to be created in email. So start with a really simple problem. Build those out. When I'm training my peers at Content Square and Heap on this, we do almost like side-by-side programming where they drive, we talk through the problem. We before we even start building anything, we say, what are we trying to do here? And we break it down into what do we think is the trigger? What do we think are the next kind of steps? Because there is a little bit of, I need to find this field in Zapier. I need to do this particular element. That it's nice to have someone who's done it before sitting by your side.
Makes sense.
Zapier has a really great online university. I think it's like learn.zapier.com. And just to make sure it's not a total shill for Zapier all episode, Make is another really great system for automations. And there's a few other really good ones. I'm just most familiar with Zapier, and I think it's kind of the best one out there. Biased a little bit, but there's that. And then there's also there's a ton of community out there. There's if you're on LinkedIn, it's No Code Operations. Claudia and Phil run that. super great group. They are
Okay.
incredible, and they have a Discord where people are constantly going back and forth on problems.
Okay.
Zapier has its own community, and they have some kind of invite-only sub-communities as you get more involved with them. Another really great place to do. And then, honestly, folks, if you're listening and you're like, I want to do something like this, send me a DM on LinkedIn, or if we're on one of the customer education Slacks together. I love helping folks with this. It's something that I think everyone should learn how to do. It's one of those skill sets, I think, kind of in line with using AI, is you need to know how to use AI. You need to know how to use automations. It's going to be the future of everything we do. So it's a great skill set to build and practice, because as soon as you have this skill set roughly developed, you start seeing ways to solve problems with automation everywhere. And then it comes back to your early question of deciding when not to automate things.
Yeah. Makes sense. I mean, it's a very important skill, because we are in a phase of time where we got to become better than the systems that are being created out there. And a lot of people put forward this question as to whether AI is going to steal jobs. But the way I look at it, and the way even you look at it, is our jobs are getting much better. We're getting much better at doing our jobs with these systems in hand. And I think it's high time that we start learning these systems. I mean, in fact, with after the first conversation that we had, I spent a lot of time checking out automations. And I would say this because, a HubSpot plan for a marketing team is around, so you have the basic plan, and then you have the next plan is around $900. And from what I can understand is I can do a lot of things that HubSpot does using automations, right? Bringing in the who's signing up with my platform, understanding what is the source, all these things. Yes, it does take a lot of time to understand these things. Yes, HubSpot would do it for me, or to take any other CRM's example, a CRM tool can do it for me. But the point is, if I can do this for even a fraction of cost and it saves my time, then might as well do it.
Yeah, and I think also with that is you have a little bit more control over your data too. You can pipe data. It doesn't just have to live in a CRM. You can say, I want to use this particular data in 2 places.
Yeah.
And that's something that a CRM does not make particularly easy. They want to be that source of truth. They want to have that gravity of like sucking all the data in and being where you have to go. So that's something that can be useful too. And I want to come back to one of your earlier things you mentioned is, there's a lot of fear around AI taking folks' jobs.
Yeah.
Definitely, I tend to be a very optimistic futurist, but yes, that's going to happen. But what's really going to take people's jobs first is not AI. It's going to be the person who's also applying for that job who can do your job and use AI is going to be the person who's more competitive when you're looking at 2 candidates side by side. If one candidate has AI experience and the other one does not, that's going to be a differentiator. And I always come back to this on a lot of these trends. I want to make it clear to folks that a lot of these tools, automation, AI, they may sound intimidating. And I'm used to working with faculty before this, that they hear the buzzwords, they see the technical things. These tools are super accessible. The super advanced, fancy things you're seeing on the news may be complicated to do, but the basics of any of these tools you can pick up in an afternoon. A lot of it builds on logic that you already know. An AI chatbot is really just, can you type really clear instructions and give good feedback based on the response? I think anyone can do that. Automation. Can you look at how things go together and say, when this happens, I want this to happen? Building it might be a little more complicated, but the basic skills of automation and basic skills of AI, everyone has available to them, and it's just going to be practice to get really good at using them in the particular tools.
I completely agree with what you're saying, and we need to drive this a bit. The whole point of this podcast at the end of the day is driving the narrative about using automations for customer education. And there aren't resources out there, so we're going to build them. And we discussed this during the starting part of the podcast about breaking the siloed nature of customer education. So how can you bring in data from various teams and make it talk with each other, right, for better decision making. And you mentioned that you worked with three different teams: customer success, scaled customer success, and one more team that you mentioned. How do you
Yeah, it's kind of
use
strategic operations.
strategic operations? Great. So how do you use automations to make data to talk to each other with respect to
Yeah,
bringing these three people together?
I think looking at these three teams together, and I think the cleanest example, because strategic operations is a
Okay.
separate bucket, is scaled customer success.
Okay.
So using things like user flow, WalkMe, app queues, those kind of products, alongside customer education.
Okay.
These teams could and often do, like scaled customer success often lives in marketing. Like those functions often live in marketing, where we're sending emails to customers. We're trying to get them to, get into the product and do X, Y, or Z.
Okay.
Customer education is trying to train them on how to do X, Y, and Z. So, our customer education tools saying, oh, this person has completed a flow from our scaled success team that teaches them how to do this, or hey, scaled success team, this person has taken a course on this feature. Now is a great time to trigger in product to say, you took a course on this.
Okay.
Let's make this, like, here's how to do it actually in the product now that you're here.
Okay.
Those kind of things where there's silos there that don't necessarily have to be there. And that's just internally in our own team. There's things that would be siloed, but I think the other thing to think about is silos company wide, and customer education. There's data in, which we talked about before, where making it clear to sales that, like, it really helps us keep the customers and keep them happy, and you can continue to upsell them if they stay a customer if you put in this data accurately. The other side of the house is we can do via automations really good data out. So we can say, for customer education, here's what's happening in our learning management system.
Okay.
We can pipe that data into our product analytics tool and say, customers who have completed this course, this training, are less likely to churn. Can we correlate that?
Yeah.
We can look at the data and we can make some pretty strong correlations. I think as a general trend is safe to say is a customer who does more training and gets more involved in the product. Naturally, if you're taking training, you're probably interested in the product. But if you are a trained customer, or if you've taken training or taken courses or are getting involved in the education materials, you're going to be more likely to use the product. If you're using the product, you're less likely to churn.
Yeah, makes sense.
We can take that data and we can defend it. And I think that's I hear a lot about folks talking about customer education as kind of a cost center. It's something that it's tough to get investment in. And I think this kind of thing, automations and getting that data out, can flip that narrative to say, just like you invest in a good CRM, just like you invest in any other sort of good set of tooling, it may not be as directly related to revenue as sales, where it's like, okay, I have the salesperson, they're bringing in X amount of revenue. Really good customer education teams, really good kind of automation and pieces like that can help you retain revenue, which I think, as we're looking at economic headwinds, is a really important thing. So that's, I think, a big shout out there is look at your data, defend it, and make it clear that, like, you're not a cost, you're an investment. Because customer education is, in my admittedly biased opinion, one of the best investments that a company can make in keeping customers.
I mean, it's great to say this, but convincing the senior management that customer education is a great thing to have, that is the tough part. And probably by using automations, you can find that correlation between, like you mentioned, a trained customer has the possibility of not churning, or retention rates are higher, renewal rates are higher. You can probably upsell to them more. So, yeah, it's great.
Yeah. And I think also with the automation side of things with customer education, they're wary because it's customer education is kind of a finite resource, but it's one of those ones that is the most scalable, especially when you factor in automation. Is you don't necessarily need a giant team to have an outsized impact. These initiatives can scale, this education can scale, these touch points can really scale. And I think that when you talk to senior leadership is an interesting aspect. Yes, give us this initial investment, give us the automation tools, and we can have an outsized impact.
Okay, that means you're saying that there's not a huge requirement to probably hire an intern to do something when you can do that with automations and probably get
Yeah.
better. I wouldn't say better content, but the possibility of having error is lesser when you were to drive these systems like AI and automation systems, right?
Yeah, and I think it comes back to too. It's just looking at our training example from earlier. We were probably just able to squeeze 2 or 3 more trainings in a week because we weren't trying to deal with all of the, minutia of scheduling training, and they were customers weren't waiting on us to say, "Oh, there's an empty slot here for training." We were able to just use these automation tools to say, "Yeah, here's training that's directly in front of you." It just makes automation makes customer education better at customer education.
Very strong words. You should probably copyright that quote of yours.
I'll just put I'll copy paste the transcript from this whole thing. Just put copyright, mostly Eric Mistry.
But
So gosh,
that's great. I mean, since we're driving this conversation, I think during the starting portions of the podcast, you mentioned about once you understand systems, you can templatize a lot of these things, right?
Yes.
So you can templatize automations. That is the verdict.
Yeah, I think the whole idea of looking at everything as a template, and this is almost step 2 of automating things, is first you look at your processes and you say, oh yeah, I can automate almost all of that. And then very similar to computer science, it's when you break down these large processes, these journeys that you want to automate into individual steps. And for mapping, there's all sorts of tools. There's, like you said, there's PowerPoint, there's Miro. There's a really great tool that I want to shout out called Puzzle. That is dedicated to doing this, kind of like you said before. It's a single-use tool. Really, really cool company. Demoed them a few times, and just they are worth looking at if you're getting into the automation space. So you can map that. You can map automations and say, these processes are automated. And let's break it down into individual, really small problems. So my problem is I need to respond to Slacks when a message comes in. That's a very simple problem to automate. Versus I need to respond to all customer queries based on what's coming in. That sounds a lot more complicated than I need to respond to Slacks. So break it down to its simplest problem, solve that simple problem once, and then you can say, how did I solve that simple problem once? Let me apply it to my next problem. So yeah, after doing this for a few years, I've got a whole set of these small templates that I use all the time when I'm building it together. It's almost like building with Legos, but a little bit more complex, a little less colorful, but still super fun.
So the next important question after listening to all this is 2 things. One is, who do I learn this from? Obviously, you can message Eric if you want, but if Eric is busy to reply, which he is not, by the way, he does reply very fast, no matter how much work he has. So let's keep that aside. But what are the resources that a person can use? And second, if you would, so we spoke about Zapier. We gave a huge advertisement. It's 1 hour right now. We spoke about Zapier probably 50 times. But if you were to talk about resources, like you mentioned Zapier, you mentioned Miro, you mentioned Puzzles, what are the specific tools that can be used for different purposes? But at the end of the day, coming back to automation.
Yeah, so for automation, I think having good mapping software, so something like Miro, something like Puzzle. There's a ton of really good folks on LinkedIn, and then from LinkedIn there are sub-communities. So No Code Operations is the one to look up. There's Phil and Claudia that run that. Really good crew to interact with. Zapier, Make is a good alternative. If you're using this for more personal pieces, there's a service called If This Then That, IFTTT. And then as far as learning it, Zapier's learn.zapier.com. Learn by doing. There's a whole bunch of that. There's a lot of communities of practice within those no-code operations groups. And then I'd also like to shout out, there's an individual, Bryce Vernon, who works for Zapier, who is always posting super cool automations, just particularly in Zapier. And because he's an internal Zap person, he's got a good ear to the ground of what's happening.
Okay.
And then Zapier itself has a really strong community that I've learned a ton from as well.
It's great. I mean, we've covered so much in 1 hour, 20 minutes. Yes, we just hit that mark, 1 hour, 20 minutes. It was really interesting. I mean, we opened the door to a very important conversation because we see a lot of webinars, we see a lot of blogs, we see a lot of landing pages on AI and customer education. There are great people out there. I spoke to Kristen Kukic a few weeks back, and she's a great person for AI and customer education. But we might not be driving a lot of conversations regarding automation, use of tactical automations in customer education, and I hope that this podcast paves the way for more conversations on automation in customer education. So that was, thank you, Eric. Thank you for spending this
Yeah.
much time and explaining to our listeners how automations would be really helpful for them.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. I always love getting to geek out about this and really get to think critically about the questions surrounding this, the why of what I do every day.
Yeah.
Because you don't always get that opportunity. And I think for anyone listening, if you're on the fence about, do I try this, do I not? Take a few minutes, get the free trial of Zapier, map out a few things, do it for a week, see what it solves for you.
Yeah.
It's super easy to get started, and anyone can do it. So thank you again so much. And yeah, ping me on LinkedIn or my personal website's ericmistry.tech if you're trying to find me. Otherwise, I was on Twitter, but since it's gone to X, I don't really.
Okay, that's great. I mean, that's one of my jobs here. I'm a product marketer, but with the Customer Educated podcast, we want to bring in people and talk about these exciting stuff. And I'm glad to have you here with Customer Educated podcast. It was nice meeting you, nice talking to you.
Cheers. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.